Men of Iron, Chapter 24. In Miles Falworth's day, one of the greatest ceremonies of courtly life was that of the bestowal of knighthood by the king, with the honours of the Bath. By far the greater number of knights were at the time created by other knights, or by nobles or officers of the crown. To be knighted by the king in person distinguished the recipient for life. It was this signal honour that the Earl, for his own purposes, wished Miles to enjoy, and for this end he had laid a few plans. The accolade was the term used for the creation of a knight upon the field of battle. It was a reward for valour for meritorious service, and was generally bestowed in a more or less offhand manner. But the ceremony of the bath was an occasion of the greatest courtly moment, and it was thus that Miles Falworth was to be knighted, in addition to the honour of a royal belting. A quaint old book treating of knighthood and chivalry gives a full and detailed account of all the circumstances of the ceremony of the creation of a Knight of the Bath. It tells us that the candidate was first placed under the care of 2 squires of honour, grave and well seen in courtship and nurture, and also in feats of chivalry, which same were likewise to the governors of all things relation to the coming honours. First of all, the barber shaved Miles, and cut his hair in a certain peculiar fashion ordained for this occasion. The squires of honour supervising the operation, thus being concluded, the candidate was solemnly conducted to the chamber, where a bath of tepid water was prepared, hung within and without with a linen, and likewise covered with rich cloths and embroidered linen. While in the bath, 2 ancient grave and reverend knights attended the bachelor, giving him meet instructions in the order and feats of chivalry. The candidate was then examined as to his knowledge and acquirements, and then, all questions being answered to the satisfaction of his examiners, the elder of the 2 dipped a handful of water out from the bath and poured it upon his head, at the same time signing his left shoulder with the sign of the cross. As soon as the ceremony was concluded, the 2 squires of honour helped the charge from the bath and conducted him to a plain bed without hangings, where they let him rest until his body was warm and dry. Then they clothed him in a white linen shirt, and over it a plain robe of russet, girded with the loins with a rope, and having a hood like unto a hermit's. As soon as the candidate had arisen, the 2 ancient knights returned, and all being in readiness, was escorted to the chapel, the 2 walking, one upon either side of him, his squires of honour marching before, and the whole party preceded by sundry minstrels, making a loud noise of music. When they came to the chapel, the 2 knights who escorted him took leave of the candidate, each saluting him with a kiss upon the cheek. No one remained with him but his squires of honour, the priest, and the chandler. In the meantime, the Narvite's armour, sword, lance, and helmet had been laid in readiness before the altar. These he watched and guarded while the others slept, keeping vigil until sunrise, during which time he shall, says the ancient authority, pass the night in orisons, prayer, and meditation. At daylight he confessed to the priest, heard matins, and communicated in mass, and then presented a lighted candle at the altar, with a piece of money stuck in it, as close to the flame as could be done, the candle being offered to the honour of God, and the money to the honour of the person who was to make him a knight. So concluded the sacred ceremony, which, being ended, his squires conducted the candidate to his chamber, and there made him comfortable, and left him to repose for a while before the second and final part of the ordinance. Such is a shortened account of the preparatory stages of the ceremonies through which Miles Falworth passed. Matters had come upon him so suddenly one after the other, and had come with such bewildering rapidity, that all that week was to him like some strange, wonderful, mysterious vision. He went through it all like one in a dream. Lord George Beaumont was one of his squires of honour. The other, by way of fitting compliment to his courage of the chivalrous lad, was the Sieur de Lermontou, his opponent soon to be. They were well versed in everything relating to knightcraft, and Miles followed all their directions with passive obedience. Then Sir James Lee and the Comte de Vermans administered the ceremony of the bath, the old knight examining him in the laws of chivalry. It occurs perhaps once or twice in one's lifetime that one passes through great happenings, sometimes of joy, sometimes of dreadful bitterness. And in just such a dazed state as Miles passed through this, it was only afterward that all comes back to one as sharply and keenly that the heart thrills, almost in agony, in living it over again. But perhaps of all the memory of that time, when it afterward came back piece by piece, none was so clear to Miles's back-turned vision as the long night spent in the chapel, watching his armor, thinking such wonderful thoughts, and dreaming such wonderful wide-eyed dreams. At such times Miles saw again the dark mystery of the castle chapel. He saw again the half-moon gleaming white and silvery through the tall narrow window, and throwing a broad form of still whiteness across the stone floor, the empty seats, and still motionless figures of the stone effigies. At such time he stood again in front of the twinkling tapers that lit the altar where his armor lay piled in a heap, heard again the deep breathing of his companions of the watch, sleeping in some empty stall, wrapped each in his cloak, and saw the old chandelier bestir himself, and rise and come forward to snuff the candles. At such times he saw again the day growing clearer and clearer through the tall glazed windows, saw it change to rosy pink, then to broad ruddy glow that threw a halo of light around Father Thomas's bald head bowed in sleep, lit up the banners and trophies hanging motionless against the stony face of the west wall, and heard again the stirring of life without, and the sound of his companions arousing themselves, saw them come forward, and heard them wish him joy that his long watch was now ended. It was nearly noon when Miles was awakened from a fitful sleep by Guskin bringing him his dinner. But as might be supposed, he had but little hunger, and ate sparingly. He had hardly ended his frugal meal before his 2 squires of honor had come in, followed by a servant carrying the garments for the coming ceremony. He saluted them gravely, and then, arising, washed his face and hands in a basin which Guskin held. Then he kneeled in prayer, the others standing silent at a little distance. As he rose, Lord George came forward. "The king and the company come presently to the great hall, Miles," said he. "It is needful for you to make all the haste that ye are able." Perhaps never had Delvin Castle seen a more brilliant and goodly company gathered in the great hall than that which came to witness King Henry create Miles Falworth a knight bachelor. At the upper end of the hall was a raised dais, upon which stood a throne, covered with crimson satin, and embroidered with lions and fleur-de-lis. This was the king's seat. He and his personal attendants had not yet come, but the rest of the company were gathered. The day being warm and quite sultry, the balcony was all aflutter with the feather fans of the ladies of the family and their attendants, who, from this high place, looked down upon the hall below. Up the center of the hall was laid a carpet of arras, and the passage was protected by wooden railings. Upon the one side were tiers for seats for the castle gentlefolk and all the guests, and upon the other stood the burghers from the town, clad in sober dun and russet, and yeomanry in green and brown. The whole of the great vaulted hall was full of the dull hum of many people waiting, and a ceaseless restlessness stirred the crowded throng. But at last a whisper went through that the king was coming. A momentary hush fell, and through it was heard the noisy clatter of horses' feet, coming nearer and nearer, and then stopping before the door. The sudden The sudden blare of trumpets broke through the hush, another pause, and then in through the great doorway of the hall came the royal procession. First of all marched, in the order of their rank, and to the number of a score or more, certain gentlemen, squires, and knights, chosen mostly from the king's attendants. Behind these came 2 attendant-at-arms in tabards, and following them part of a dozen or more baronets and barons. Behind these again, a little space intervening, came 2 heralds, also in tabards. A group of the greater nobles attended upon the king, following in the order of their rank. Next came the king-at-arms, and a little distance, and walking with sober slowness, the king himself. with the Earl and the Count directly attendant upon him, the one marching in the right hand and the other on the left. A breathless silence filled the whole space as the royal procession advanced slowly up the hall. Through the stillness could be heard the muffled sound of the footsteps on the carpet, the dry rustling of silk and satin garments, and the clear clink and jingle of chains and jeweled ornaments, but not the sound of a single voice. After the moment or two of bustle and confusion, of the king taking his place, had passed, another little space of expectation silent fell. At least there, suddenly, came the noise of acclamation of those who stood without the door, cheering and the clapping of hands, sounds heralding the immediate advent of Myles and his attendants. The next moment, the little party entered the hall. First of all, Guskin, bearing Myles' sword in both hands, hilt resting against his breast, the point elevated at an angle of 45 degrees. It was sheathed in a crimson scabbard, and the belt of Spanish leather, studded with silver bosses, was wound around it. From the hilt of the sword dangled the glittering spurs of his coming knighthood, and at a little distance behind his squire followed Myles, the centre of all observation. He was clad in a Novite dress, arranged under Lord George's personal supervision. It had been made somewhat different from the fashion usual at such times, and was intended to indicate in a manner the candidate's extreme usefulness in arms. The outer garment was a tabard robe of white wool, embroidered at the hem with fine lines of silver, the gathered loosely at the waist with a belt of lavender, stitched and threaded with silver. Beneath he was clad in armour, a present from the Earl, new and polished till it shone with dazzling brightness, the breastplate covered with a tunic of white satin, embroidered with silver. Behind Myles and on either hand came his squires of honour, sponsors, and his friends, a little company of some half a dozen in all, as they advanced slowly up the great, dim, high-vaulted room. The whole multitude broke forth into the humming buzz of applause. Then a sudden clapping of hands began near the doorway, ran down through the length of the room, and was taken up by all with noisy clatter. "Saw I never youth so comely," whispered one of the Lady Anne's attendants, gentlewoman. "Sure he looks as Sir Galahad must have looked when he came first to King Arthur's court." Myles knew that he was very pale, for he felt rather than saw the restless crowd of faces on either side. His eyes were fixed directly before him, upon the dais wherein sat the king, and the Earl of Mackworth standing at his right hand, the Comte de Vermoy at the left, and the others ranged around and behind the throne. It was thus with the same tense feeling of dreamy unreality that Myles walked slowly up the length of the hall, measuring his steps by those of Guskin. Suddenly he felt Lord George Beaumont touch him lightly upon the arm, and almost instinctively he stopped short. He was standing just before the covered steps of the very throne. He saw Guskin mount to the third step, stop short, kneel, and offer the sword and the spurs he carried to the king, who took the weapon and laid it across his knees. Then the squire bowed low, and walking backward withdrew to one side, leaving Myles standing alone, facing the throne. The king unlocked the spur chains from the sword hilt, and then, holding the gilt spurs in his hand for a moment, he looked Myles straight in the eye and smiled. Then he turned and gave one of the spurs to the Earl of Mackworth. The Earl took it with a long bow, turned, and came slowly down the steps to where Myles stood. Kneeling upon one knee, and placing Myles' foot upon the other, Lord Mackworth set the spur in its place, and latched the chain up over the instep. He drew the sign of the cross upon Myles' bended knees, set the foot back upon the ground, and rose with such slow dignity, and bowed to the king, withdrawing a little to one side. As soon as the Earl had fulfilled his office, the king gave the second spur to the Comte de Vermoy, and set it to Myles' other foot with the same ceremony that the Earl had observed, withdrawing, as he had done, to one side. A pause of motionless silence followed, and then the king slowly arose, and began deliberately to unwind the belt from around the scabbard of the sword he held. As soon as he stood, the Earl and the Count advanced, and taking Myles by either hand, led him forward and up the steps of the dais to the platform above. As they drew a little to one side, the king stooped and buckled the sword belt around Myles's waist, then, rising again, lifted his hand, and struck him upon the shoulder, crying in a loud voice, "Be ye a good knight!" Instantly a loud sound of applause and the clapping of hands filled the whole hall, in the midst of which the king laid both hands upon Myles's shoulder and kissed him upon the right cheek. So the ceremony ended. Myles was no longer Myles Falworth, but Sir Myles Falworth, knight by order of the Bath, and by grace of the king.